Oh, there you are.
Here I am. How are you, Jane? Can you hear me? Maybe I've got to turn on my microphone.
I might have to start in a bit.
Okay. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Is that
Yes.
Mary?
Yes.
Hi, Mary.
Hi.
Everyone can say hi to Mary Colony. She's the former education director, used to be Rachel's boss at the center. And
Is
uh,
Rachel there?
Rachel's here, yes.
Oh
Yeah,
my
she joined us
God.
as the SPC earlier this week was the beginning of her time here, but she's been here since just before Christmas. So,
Unbelievable.
yeah.
Hi, Rach.
And can you hear me, Mark, down in Albuquerque? Let's see. Looks like Mark, well, maybe Mark isn't there yet. Jane, do you know if the other folks are in yet then? It doesn't look like it.
Hi, Don. Yeah, we're here.
Oh, you're there. Okay. I guess I have to, yeah, there, I've got an extra thing. We might have some glitches tonight in using this new software because I'm not that familiar with it. But let's go ahead and start. And we'll start tonight with a few prayers before we begin. Last time we did the Heart Sutra, but I think tonight what we'll do is we'll just do the praise to Shakyamuni Buddha. I think you all have that in the prayer book at Lama Yeshe House. One thing before we get started is those of you who are from a distance, if you could turn off your microphones for now, just to make sure that I'm not getting any sort of feedback or anything. And then if you need to ask a question, there'll be an opportunity to do that at points in the evening. Then you can go ahead and turn your microphone back on. So the praise to Shakyamuni Buddha in the prayer books that we have here is on page 73. So let's go ahead and start with reciting this. What I'm going to do is what we've been doing up in Taos on Thursday nights, which is recite this 3 times, and then we go forward and just do the mandala offering and the refuge prayer. And so just have minimal prayers for tonight and going forward. Page 73. To the founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan. I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan. I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. Then in the prayer books, we'll go forward to the short mandala offering. And this is on either 97 or 98 because we have 2 different versions of the prayer book. And so we'll just do the first verse there, not the request to turn the wheel of Dharma, and then the offering mantra in Sanskrit. And let's do this in Tibetan tonight. Sajipo Zhuxing me tok traham ri rabling ji ni de gyan padi sangye shindu mikte uwayi Jokunam Dakshingla Chopasho Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. Then refuge in bodhicitta before the teaching, once in English and then twice in Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chunyan gipe sonam gi jola penchir sangye drupar shok Sangye chodang soki choknam la Jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chunyan gipe sonam gi jola penchir sangye drupar sho. Okay, let's go ahead and start with a short meditation before we begin the class. So again, just find a good meditation posture. We'll just do a few minutes of silent meditation on the breath. I'm sure most of you have some instruction on doing that, so I don't need to provide that. But just try to keep your awareness with the breath whenever the mind wanders, and bring the mind back to the breath. And after a few minutes of this in silence, I'll lead you in a short reflection to set motivation for tonight. So in last week's class, we did go through some of the preliminary material that speaks to why we need to study this topic of minds and mental factors. It all boils down to essentially the fact that if we are ever to achieve any lasting results in terms of liberation and enlightenment, even just to attain temporal happiness, we need to tame our minds. We need to know our minds. We looked at many quotes that talk about how everything starts with the mind, how everything is created from the mind. So even enlightenment is created from the mind, and one of the main causes for enlightenment is generating bodhicitta, generating this sincere altruistic intention that transcends our ordinary preoccupation with ourselves, that embraces the welfare of all beings, and that sets its sight on complete enlightenment for ourselves so we can lead others to that state. So as we go about this second evening of exploring this topic of minds and mental factors, try to do that with this motivation of bodhicitta, so that what we learn through our interaction, teaching, discussion, so on, that all of this becomes the cause for us to achieve enlightenment, and therefore the cause for all sentient beings to achieve enlightenment. And just hold that intention very deeply in your heart. Okay. So let me just check and make sure that everyone is okay in terms of if anyone who's tuning in from a distance, who's live streaming this, if you can't hear me, then you can, or if there's any problems, I guess if you can't hear me, then you can't hear me, but if there's any problems, then you can undo your mic and let me know, but otherwise, I'll assume everything's fine. So let's go ahead then, and we're going to continue with what we began last time. We're working with the text that I think all of you have at this point. The text is called A Necklace for Those of Clear Awareness and so on by Yeshe Geltsen. Last week's class, I talked a little bit about who Yeshe Geltsen was, the tutor to the 8th Dalai Lama, pretty amazing scholar and practitioner. And then we went and we began the introduction part of this text, the introductory part that includes the homage verses, which are the first 6 verses on page 6. And then the final verse, the 7th verse, that is the promise to compose, where Yeshe Geltsen sort of sets out his intention of completing this text, and is also doing that with great humility and so on. And then pretty much what we've looked at since then is this whole idea of why we need to study this topic. Looking at various verses from Nagarjuna and so on, all speaking to the fact that everything starts from our minds, that samsara is created from our minds, and nirvana is created from our minds, and so on. And so we continued with that all the way to the middle of page 9, I think, or maybe even to the end of page 9. I don't know if I marked it correctly, but we let me go through this last part anyway. That's at the middle of page 9 after the verses, and just repeat that, and then we can move forward into looking at minds and mental factors with a bit more detail. And I have a little more preliminary information that I'm going to share on PowerPoint that will inform our discussion as we go into this. And at the very beginning, I'm going to move around what we're covering just a little bit. But anyway, I'll give you instruction on that in terms of the pages that we're referring to in the text. So for now, in the middle of page 9, where it says, just as it has been said above, all of cyclic existence, the environment and its inhabitants, arises through the force of its own causes, actions, and afflictions. This has been taught not just once, but again and again in the sutras and tantras, as well as their commentaries. Likewise, it has been taught that all the excellent qualities of the paths and grounds of the 3 vehicles, the resultant Buddha field, exalted bodies, lifespan, deeds, as well as exalted activities, arise solely from their own causes. wholesome, virtuous minds. Therefore, the root of all of cyclic existence and nirvana is established to be the mind itself. Hence, it is of utmost importance to understand the modes of minds and mental factors. Thus, here I shall compose a brief presentation on minds and mental factors. And again, there are two parts to this. And the main part of the text, the main body of the text, is the first part, where we look at the individual entities and divisions of minds first. And we delineate what minds are. We'll do a bit more of that tonight. And then what are mental factors in this context, that division of all of our consciousness or awareness into those two categories. And then we'll look at the final point, which is a summary of the salient points in their application to practice, which is a nice feature of this text because it's very much about applying everything that we learn to our practice. And I'm going to try to keep what I present in that vein, as we go through each of the various mental factors to understand their role in creating our problems and their role, perhaps, in solving our problems. So the text is then divided from there into these individual entities, an explanation of minds and an explanation of mental factors. So let's go to the PowerPoint. This is, again, stay with me here in terms of this, trying to go to the desktop. Let's see if I go to desktop 2. I think that's changed to that, but let me make sure that I can do the PowerPoint. So the PowerPoint's up here. Let me make sure that it's up on the other screen. I don't think it is. There it is. Okay. Optimize for full screen. Oh, I'm not sure what. Okay, let me try that. Okay. So I'm hoping that the folks who are online have the slides in front of you, the PowerPoint. Is that so?
Looks good. Looks
It's
good,
good?
Don.
Okay, good. All right, we're going to jump ahead a little bit. I went through some of these slides last time, so I just want to go, let me see where I'm going to be. Let me cover a few of these things again. Again, the whole topic that we can say that we're exploring is awareness. And this is from Mind and Cognition Part 1. Remember that what we're doing here in this course is Part 2, where we're looking more specifically at mental factors and kind of exploring them. In Mind and Cognition Part 1 is where we look at Buddhist epistemology, and I'm just pulling a few pieces from there. Remember that last week we looked at this idea of the definition of awareness is a knower, the definition of consciousness is that which is clear and knowing, and that we can make these terms, call these terms synonymous: awareness, knower, consciousness, and this is in general in the presentation in Mind and Cognition. Here, however, we're going to be dividing things into another way of looking at awarenesses, into what are called main or primary minds and mental factors. So let's look at each of these a little bit in terms of the definition that Prabhuchak is the author of the text that we used in the first part, which again, many of you in the room haven't taken, but this is one part of that text where Prabhuchak does go into dividing up the mind in various ways. And this is one way that we can parse up all of our mental activity, is that we have what are called main minds and mental factors. So the main mind is a main knower that is posited by way of apprehending the entity of its object. So again, this is something that we're going to see repeated tonight as well, because we will be exploring the definition of mind in our text and looking at it there. We'll do that in just a moment. I don't need to go through maybe the stuff at the bottom there, because this is again all from Part 1. You're not getting it. It didn't go to the... That's weird. Let me try that again from here, from current slide. Maybe I have to go here, perhaps. No? That's weird. Maybe it's because, sorry, we're having some problems here. There we go. So maybe I need to check in with the folks there. Are you seeing the screen change now?
No, it still looks good.
So are you? I'm just wanting to make sure. Are you seeing the screen change?
Yeah, no, we can. No, it's still on the Prabhuchak.
Okay. Somehow I've got to figure out how to get this one to show on yours. Maybe I need to go back to. Oh. I've got something going on here. Let me stop the share for now, and let me try to do the share again from trying to get this other one up. This is what I want to do. Okay.
Looks perfect.
Okay. Now when I do this, Justin, do you get a new slide?
Yep.
Okay, you got the one on main minds. Okay, good. New technology, like I said, it's going to take a couple of sessions probably to make sure we have it all right. So in terms of main minds, there are two types of primary mind. There are sensory primary minds and mental primary minds. It sounds weird to say mental minds, right? Because they're both referring to mind. But sensory primary minds are the fivefold that we normally talk about, namely visual, audio, olfactory, gustatory, and tactile primary minds. This is Geshe Rabten saying this. So then we have what are called the mental minds, which are the mental consciousness, mental primary minds. So we have the sense consciousnesses consisting of the five, and we have mental consciousness consisting of just the one. So when minds are divided by way of entity, we would then say that there are six, because we have the five that are sensory, and we have the one that is mental consciousness. Now, I'm going to talk about these a little bit more so you get a bit of a flavor. Again, this is explored in great detail in Mind and Cognition Part 1, because we look at the various ways that sensory consciousnesses know their objects and the way that mental consciousness know their objects. But I'll talk a little bit about that tonight in a real introductory way. So one thing that I want to share from Mind and Cognition Part 1 in regard to that is the division of mind also, or consciousness, into conceptual and non-conceptual. And why I'm doing this is just because this idea is an important one. It's not going to come up quite as immediately in terms of our text, but nonetheless, it's something that will inform the way that we go about this study to some degree. Our conceptual minds, again, this distinction of conceptual or non-conceptual, as it says in the slide here, is it categorizes consciousnesses based on the manner in which they get at their objects, either directly or by means of a mental image. And so actually those are in the reverse order. Those that access directly are non-conceptual. Those that access by means of a mental image are conceptual. And this is coming up in the next slide as well. All right. So let's take a look at this. What does this mean to be doing this? And again, to give an idea of what is explored in that first course in regard to these different types of consciousnesses. The first one, conceptual consciousnesses, get at their objects by means of a mental image. And that's the Wylie in that in Tibetan. It's usually pronounced Donchi. And that is defined by Geshe Rabten as a mentally projected entity that, whilst not being the object, appears as though it were. So if I were to ask you all right now to think of the color purple, okay, so you're thinking of the color purple. You have just created a donchi for the color purple in your mind. Is it the actual color purple? No, because it's only your mental image of the color purple. And this is one of the things about our consciousnesses that are conceptual, is that they always have some degree of mistakenness with regard to them, because we think that what we are thinking about is the actual object. Whereas our non-conceptual consciousnesses, of which all of the sense consciousnesses are, get at their objects directly. So if I were to look at the purple that is in Jane's shirt, for example, here in the Gompa, if I were to take that in, then I am taking in the color purple through my eye consciousness. There's no image involved, because the purple is appearing to my eye consciousnesses and is registering in my awareness as purple. Now my conceptual thinking about that purple, if I say, oh, I really like that purple, Jane, that's very pretty. And Jane's very happy that I like her purple. And so, but then all of a sudden I've taken that image of purple that has appeared to my eye consciousness, and I've made it an object of my conceptual mind that is now thinking about that and comparing it to other purples, for example, and making some sort of a value or quality decision in regard to that purple. Yes, Jane. Is it the label itself, is Jane's question? Well, to some degree, we can say that the label is part of the process of developing this mental image, but we can have mental images perhaps without a sort of language label with regard to things. You can have, kind of, this is the way all of our conceptual minds are knowing, is that we create an image or an idea for what things are. So it's not purely, I guess label to some degree. And it's interesting, all of the teachings on this, and where in part one is drawn from the Sautrantika tradition, which is one of the lower schools, but the translation of it into Prasangika terms, into, which is again very much the point of view that we're going to be looking at in regard to this text on minds and mental factors. But nonetheless, the perception, kind of that translation of what's said in the Sautrantika text in regard to conception and what Prasangika holds, it's always hard to make sure that we're dealing with equivalent language. So I'm not sure when we say, the labels. But it's certainly an idea. Sometimes even in the traditional teachings, they talk about meaning generalities versus sound generalities. Meaning generalities meaning something that we have actually experienced, whereas a sound generality is something we've heard about. So if I've never been to India, if people would tell me all about what India is like and all this, I get some impressions of what India is like, but I don't have the meaning generality of it. I haven't actually experienced it. And so there's different ways that we could talk about those dunshis and what's going on in regard to our conceptual mind working with this stuff. So I don't want to go too far into this because this is really just to give you the idea that, again, our conceptual minds are always working with something that's an intermediary. It's sort of like an idea of something as opposed to the actual thing. Yeah. And it's happening at a very, Tony was saying, a personal projection towards the object, but it's happening at a very sort of cursory level in terms of any time we experience something and our conceptual mind gets involved. But then, of course, we have a lot of ways that the conceptual mind overlays stuff, and that's a lot of what we're going to be seeing in terms of the mental factors. When we start talking about some of the virtuous states of mind or non-virtuous states and so on, all of these things arise on the basis of conceptuality that is projected in regard to something that we're experiencing. And so it is the conceptual domain that a lot of what we're going to be looking at, that's kind of where it all falls. We're going to be looking at mostly how we work with conceptuality and change our conceptuality, obviously, to be able to create the causes for happiness as opposed to continue to create the causes for suffering. Our non-conceptual consciousnesses are getting directly at their objects, and there's not a lot of problem there in that regard. If our eye consciousness is seeing or tasting something through our tongue consciousness that is really delicious and delightful, those are simply sensory experiences where that direct information is being brought in, but our mind gets involved. Once our conceptual mind, there is a bridge that occurs between our direct experience through our senses and our mental consciousness, that kind of momentary bridge crossing over that data from what we receive from our senses into our mental consciousness. But once it comes in a direct way, and then we start overlaying on that idea all the other things that complicate it for us. So, this is why we have different views of different people, of different objects, and a lot of that can be karmically informed. But nonetheless, it's not set in stone. It's something that we can change by virtue of changing our minds and how we think. Generally not the problem. The problem is in our conceptuality, in our thinking about things, in our way of engaging with things. And it's just important to understand from the beginning that there is the actual object is, that we are always thinking about a mental image that isn't the actual object. It's only referring to the actual object. It's kind of related to the actual it has as its determined object or its conceptual object. So let's go on to the next slide and we'll look at this in a little bit more detail. I divided it into sensory and mental, and then we said sensory have 5. So essentially, all 5 of our sense consciousnesses are necessarily non-conceptual. So again, I pointed that out earlier, but you do consciousnesses, because our sense consciousnesses are simply portals, if you will, through which all of this data comes in. And as we're going to see, they even have their own distinct way of bringing in data. We don't bring in data around, tactile sensations through our nose. Each of them have their own delineated way of relating to objects, and they are knowing those things in a non-conceptual. And this might be, again, something that takes a little explanation, can be either conceptual or non-conceptual. The ones that are pointed out that are important to pay attention to in terms of non-conceptual, well, there's generally, here's is the example I have on the slide, that one little moment of time. Remember I said there's a bridge between when my eye consciousness sees the purple in Jane's shirt and when my mental consciousness has a moment of what's called mental direct perception, where the purple does appear, but it's so quick that it's not noticeable. Our minds don't detect it. There's that bridge that occurs that allows awareness into my mental consciousness. But then, as I said, once I make a mental idea of that purple and I start overlaying thoughts about that purple and values, quality, have you, all of that becomes part of the conceptual mind. So those mental direct perceivers are one example of direct perception, something in the mental consciousness that can be non-conceptual. But there are also the direct perception. Yogic direct perception is when you have developed a union of what's called calm abiding and special insight, these two very powerful sight, that we can then unite those and produce yogic direct perception. We often talk in this tradition, right, about having a direct realization of emptiness. Well, that's what There can be other examples of yogic direct perception, but that's the one that we're kind of aiming for. And we'll be talking about that here and there as we go through mental factors as well. So let's see if there's questions on this topic. I'm sorry. What was? Oh, the union. The question here was, I said that up on the slide. That's another example of a direct perception, is what's called a yogic direct perceiver. And it is produced in reliance upon, with the support of, to have a direct perception of emptiness, which is what we need to do in order to attain liberation and enlightenment. We have to train greatly in all of this, knowing our mind through deep analysis of the nature of things and so on. So that's, again, a little bit of an aside, but it's to give you an idea of this ways that these two different types of consciousness, three consciousnesses, of which there are five, and mental consciousness, which again is just the one bucket in which either conceptual or non-conceptual happens, but how even in mental consciousness we can have different ways of knowing, depending upon this is conceptual, though. This is what's going on with our conceptual mind frequently. And that's why, again, knowing all of these factors and knowing how to work with them to understand when our conceptuality is looking at things in ways that aren't in line with reality is important. Whereas those ways that we can use our conceptuality to increase our wisdom and increase our awareness of the mind and what our virtuous factors are mated to that, and eventually attain these deeper states, such as that yogic direct perceiver that will allow us to know reality in that way. So let me just check in with the folks from a distance. Were there any questions from Denver or anyone else tuning in? No, it doesn't sound like it. Okay. So let's go ahead to the next slide. The next slide is going to talk a little bit then about these primary consciousnesses in terms of, is because it is in the beginning of the text, and I just thought I'd go ahead and introduce this idea that we do have various conditions that cause a consciousness to arise. And we're going to look quite. All six primary consciousnesses do have what's called, again, dominant condition. Can't remember if there's other names for this in some of the other texts. Faculty that acts as a support to empower that consciousness to know its respective objects. So it thus is the condition that is mainly responsible for that individual consciousness. So again, if we talk about delineating, let's start with the regard to that. Is this okay to move forward? Okay. Each of the five sensory primary minds, Geshe Repton says, are defined according to the dominant condition, Kerr. And in this case, with regard to the five senses, they are physical in nature. And frequently in modern days, they talk about it just being the eye that is referring to the organs. But in classical Tibetan Buddhist literature, they actually refer to this as being very subtle, lucid matter that is embedded within these physical organs. And they even say that certain clairvoyants have particular shapes to each of them, and I don't have all those memorized. I can't really bring them to mind. But so what they are really talking about, when we talk about, let's talk about the first of the five sense consciousnesses, depends upon the eye. And this is true, right? I mean, because we know that if you don't have eyes, if you're born with defective eyes or eyes that are impaired in some way, that you cannot have a visual consciousness. Well, in Buddhist terms, they would say that you don't have this subtle lucid matter that is embedded within the eyeball that allows you to know the forms, visible forms, that are the object of eye consciousness. In essence, what eyes know are shape and color. You could boil it all down to that. That's really, so the eye sense power is what allows us to be able to discern shape and color, what are the aspects of visible form. Then that is one factor that contributes to the eye consciousness arising. And we'll see there are two others for all of these. But it is about what makes it kind of empowered with regard to its own specific objects, what is sort of uncommon to the other power or the other consciousnesses. So as I mentioned earlier, our eye consciousness, our ear consciousness has the ear sense power, which enables it to know sounds. Then we have the nose consciousness, which is enabled through the nose sense power to know smells, and so on. So we have abilities on the basis of five different sense powers. Those five sense powers are all physical in regard to this presentation. The mental primary mind, however, depends upon what we call a mental sense power, which is essentially a primary cognition that arises independently. This is how we define a mental primary mind. That dominant condition for that mental primary mind is always a previous moment of mind. Because we don't have anything physical that enables our mental consciousness to be there. Our mental consciousness is always arising on the basis of whatever people might wonder, well, isn't the brain a physical organ that we would say is responsible for our mental consciousness? And in traditional Buddhist terms, that is not how it's set out. The brain does play a role, obviously, in the functioning of processes and so on. But the brain is not the mind and is not the dominant condition for our mental consciousness in this presentation. So let's review. We got five consciousnesses. And so they are, again, the subtle matter that is embedded within the various aspects. So when it comes to body, for example, well, anywhere where you have the ability to know tactile objects, the contact of your finger on your eye, any of those places of the body have a body sense power embedded within them. The nose sense power is within the nose, eye within the eye, and so on. Those are what enable those 5 consciousnesses to arise. Power only requires a previous moment of mind to do that. That's what its own dominant condition is. And we usually call that the mental sense power. So let's look at the listing then that we're going to actually see repeated in our text in terms of these 6 primary consciousnesses. So on the screen, senses, as well as the 6th, the mental consciousness. And we see that they are delineated as an individual knower that is supported by each of their respective sense powers, and then what it empowers them to observe is an individual knower that is supported by the eye sense power and observes visual form. The ear primary consciousness is an individual knower that is supported by the ear sense power and observes sound, and so on. And again, I'm happy of all of the slides. I can forward those to you at some point, so you don't need to write everything down, because this is a big slide. There's a lot of words up there. But essentially what we are condition that is necessary for a consciousness to arise by putting it in this format, right? We've said there's a sense power that's necessary. That's the dominant condition. We also have what is called the object condition. The object condition, and actually let me go forward to, I'm going to hope people, this slide has the 3 conditions that we usually talk about that are involved in our consciousnesses arising. So the dominant condition is to be there. Then you have, and to know its particular object. And then there's the object condition, which is the actual object that induces the consciousness. It's registered by the consciousness to know it. And then the final condition is what's called an immediate condition, which is actually similar to the mental sense power that we just talked about when we talk about mental consciousness, but this is their consciousness. So let's go back to the example that we had of me looking at, through my eye consciousness, observing the color purple that is in Jane's shirt. So my eye consciousness is empowered to be receptive to the color purple that is the object condition. So I've got the dominant condition of the eye sense power, the object condition, which is the purple on her shirt. Then I have the immediate condition type, because maybe I was hearing something and then suddenly I noticed the purple in Jane's shirt. Well, then my ear consciousness that was there the moment before became the immediately preceding condition, that moment when my eye consciousness observes the color purple in Jane's shirt through my eye sense power and knows it. So again, this is just to point out that these 3 conditions, they are mentioned at one point in the text. So this isn't a huge topic within this text, but so that you gain some appreciation for kind of how knowing occurs. We're not going to go into great depths about all the different ways that knowers are formed, because that's part 1 of mind and cognition, but at least to give you a flavor for the elements that are absolutely involved, in regard to any moment of consciousness arising. So let's go being there. The dominant condition would be our mental sense power, which is the immediately preceding moment of mind. We talked about that a few minutes ago. That is equivalent to the immediate condition. Immediate condition are going to be equivalent, because how the mental consciousness is empowered is always through a previous moment of consciousness. Is everyone following that one? Maybe I need to say it again. Okay. Could people nod their heads? Are you guys okay? Everyone's okay. All right. So the object condition gets to be tricky, because again, when you have conceptual mind involved, we would say that conceptuality, because what's appearing to it is a meaning generality, that meaning mental image that we talked about earlier, that mental image, that donchi, is the way that conceptual mind knows. We would say that that's generally how the object condition for that. But of course, it relies upon its respective object. So if I saw the color purple through my eye consciousness, but then my mental consciousness started to think about that color purple, it obviously has some relationship to the color purple. But the object that is inducing the consciousness at that moment is the appearing object to that consciousness, which is the idea of purple, or the mental image of purple, rather than the actual purple. Again, this would be in the Prasangika presentation of this. I don't know that it would be quite the same in Sautrantika, but I think it is. I'm pretty sure it is. So this was just, again, to give you an idea, because when we get to page 13, we're going to see the 3 conditions, page 9. Let's go forward for now to page 12 at the bottom. I'm going to go off of the shared screen here for a second. Let's see if I can do that. Not getting that to come up. Maybe I have to do something. I don't know how I'm going to be able to do that. Maybe I have to. Okay, I guess we're going to stay on the screen for a bit. Okay, so I'm sorry, Justin, I'm having problems with going back to the video. So anyway, let's go to the bottom of page 12 of the text, and it says there, regarding minds, Vasubandhu is a discussion of the 5 aggregates. This is a text that will be referred to occasionally in our text. It's not one of the main ones that this topic is drawn from. We'll cover those in a moment, but the question is raised, what is a primary consciousness? It is that which knows an object of observation. So we're in this topic of main minds, kind of exploring what it is, and so he starts with this idea of what is a main mind or a primary mind. And at the top of page 13, it mentions that primary consciousnesses know individually. This is from the Abhidharma Kosha, the Treasury of Knowledge. So this idea of them knowing individually is kind of an interesting thing. What does it mean to say primary consciousnesses know individually? We can say that just as we went through in that explanation, they do know their objects individually. You know, the mental consciousness, we didn't quite go into that in that slide that I had on here earlier. Let me put that one back up. The very last one where it says mental primary consciousness, this is defined as an individual knower that is supported by the mental sense power and observes phenomena. Phenomena is everything, right? Phenomena is everything that exists. So the mental consciousness is actually empowered to know everything. It doesn't know everything in every moment, or certainly, you know, doesn't have that ability yet. As a Buddha, you can know all phenomena. But in essence, we can say that anything that exists can be known by the mental consciousness. But in essence, that whole category of phenomena is unique to the mental consciousness. Every other consciousness has its own portion of what exists that it knows. As we saw when we went through this, visual form is the domain of the eye consciousness. Sounds are the domain of the ear consciousness, and so on. Each of the 5 senses knowing their respective objects individually. So that can be one meaning of talking about primary consciousnesses knowing individually. But another way we can talk about it is regard to individual in the sense of only one arising, in that we don't have 2 eye consciousnesses at one time. You don't have 2 mental consciousnesses at one time. You only have an individual manifestation of them. You know, in the Sautrantika presentation, again, I don't know if this is true for the middle way presentation. They generally say that there's only one main mind present at any one time. So while my eye consciousness is present seeing something, my ear consciousness can't be hearing something. Now you might think, well, what happens when you're watching a movie? When you're watching all of that going on, you're listening to what's going on, maybe you're even eating popcorn, so you get the taste consciousness going or whatever. You got all this happening. Plus your mental consciousness is thinking about the movie and trying to formulate the plot and what's going on and so on. Using recollection. Oh, that was the character that was in 3 scenes ago or whatever. So it's obvious that all of that seems to be happening at the same time. But according to that presentation, we actually only have one main mind present at any one instant of time, which is actually defined as 1/65th of a finger snap, which is quite minute. So the appearance is that there's a lot going on at any one time, but our consciousness is actually moving very quickly from object to object, from a visual to an audio to, you know, a mental consciousness thinking about the movie to whatever. We're taking in all of this data in a very sequential, but nonetheless, you know, individual way. And it forms a sort of I don't know, kind of canvas of everything that we're taking in, so that we are able to watch movies and things like that. At least this is the presentation that Sautrantika has. I've seen some teachers, Venerable George Chernoff in his commentary actually says that you can have more than one consciousness present at a particular time. But again, the traditional teachings of the mind and cognition in the first part, it's only that an individual moment would have one consciousness, one main mind present, which seems to make sense, because once you start dealing with different types of awarenesses arising at the same time, it seems like it would get quite complex. Now, our minds are incredibly complex, as we're going to see with the mental factors, because you can have quite a few mental factors arising at the same time. But as we go into looking at these 2 ideas of minds and mental factors, we'll see that there's actually a unique relationship with them in terms of how they are all arising and so on. So let's continue on then with the text. We looked at this idea again of the top of page 13. Primary consciousnesses know individually. The next paragraph says, omniscient Gyaltsap also taught that the definition of a mind is a knower that is distinguished by knowing the mere entity of an object. This is very similar to what we saw earlier, right? That if, and again, what I'm trying to do, and just to get back to encapsulating the presentation tonight, is I'm going to be working mostly with main minds or primary minds first, and then we'll go and we'll start talking about the relationship between those main minds and mental factors. So main mind is knowing the mere entity of an object, and as we'll see, the mental factors get involved more in the specifics, the particulars. So continuing with the text on page 13, it says, the way of explanation of the ornament of reasoning on valid cognition has already been described above. And so again, this is something that we will be going through later, but hold on to that thought. When primary consciousnesses are divided, there are 6 groups of primary consciousnesses, and this is exactly what's on your screen, right? It is just as it has been said in the Compendium of Knowledge. The first question, what are primary consciousnesses? They are the 6 groups of primary consciousnesses, the eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mental primary consciousnesses. Then the question is raised for each of these. What is the eye? What is the ear? What is it? And so on. I'm not going to go through all of this in the text because it's also on the screen in front of you. And the only difference in wording is that when it says in the answer to I consciousness, for example, I primary consciousness, it says it is an individual knower that is supported by the I and observes form, is that I've just elaborated on that and called it the I sense power. Because again, the traditional teachings don't say that it is equivalent to the I, meaning the I organ that we know of in Western science, but rather is the I sense power, that subtle lucid matter that is embedded within the I, that empowers the eye to know form. Because people can have eyeballs without them being empowered to know form. I mean, that, again, in Western science, they would say, oh, it's because the retina isn't doing this and da-da-da-da and all this other stuff. But in traditional Buddhist thinking, they would say that they lack the eye sense power. They aren't empowered to be able to take in visual form through the eyes. So each of these, again, has their own individual sense power, and then they, of course, have their own object that they observe, with mental primary consciousnesses observing all of phenomena, because everything can be known, not maybe in that direct way initially, because our our mental consciousness is generally conceptual, and we're knowing things through a meaning generality or this mental image that I mentioned, this donchi. But nonetheless, we can get at objects. We can still know objects through that medium. And that's why the mental consciousness has this kind of observation of all phenomena. So then at the very bottom of page 13, it says, with regard to the way of positing the 3 conditions that I just mentioned for the 6 engaging consciousnesses, there appear to be many differences between the higher and lower tenet systems that need to be distinguished, but I will not elaborate on them here, so I am not going to elaborate on them either. And I can't say I even understand them all. I feel somewhat ignorant when it comes to all of these various other things. We do study the tenet systems as part of the basic program, and it's a really useful way to examine all the different philosophical systems that are set out as part of Buddhist study. Some of those get mentioned on the next page, and I'm going to go ahead and complete this section to the top of page 15, and then we're going to go back and look at mental factors, because this is still on the topic of primary minds or main minds, consciousnesses, that category, as opposed to the mental factors. So on the top of 14, I'm going to go through this again in a very brief way, but at least give you some idea of what's being talked about here. It says, although the so-called mind basis of all and afflicted intellect have been explained in the texts of Asanga and his brother Vasubandhu, here I merely wish to write about the identities of minds and mental factors common to the higher and lower tenet systems, as an essential branch of developing an understanding of the way in which actions and afflictions bind us to cyclic existence. This occurs on the occasion of a being of the intermediate scope, when sustaining the objective observation and subjective aspect of the stages of the path to enlightenment, in the context of reflecting on true origins, the drawbacks of cyclic existence. So let me touch on what's all covered there. There is, in what's called the Chittamatra, the mind-only school, in one branch of that, they posit 8 different consciousnesses instead of 6. they add these two that are mentioned, what's called the mind basis of all, alaya vijnana, storehouse consciousness, yeah, that's another name for it. Then they also posit what's called an afflicted mentality or afflicted intellect, which is kind of where all of the afflictions, seeds of the afflictions and so on arise. Or no, I'm sorry, that's where the mistake happens, right? And then all the seeds that produce all the karmic effects are what resides in the mind basis of all. And again, we're not going to get into a whole discussion of mind only and what it presents, but these two they feel are necessary in order to posit that liberation can be attained from that. And they'd also need to posit something that carries over from life to life that brings all the karmic seeds. So it's a necessary part of their way of looking at what consciousness is. In all the other traditions, there's only 6 consciousnesses, the 6 that we normally talk about. So what Yeshe Gyaltsen is saying in this part of the text is simply saying, although both Vasubandhu and Asanga talk about those two, make it, a presentation with 8 consciousnesses, and we are relying upon their texts, essentially, as we're going to see. Those are the main players that we are relying upon. He's saying he's going to neglect those because he wants to present something that's in common to all the various tenet systems, which is the idea that there are 6 consciousnesses and that there are a number of mental factors that we're going to be going into. Then he goes on to say that the main reason, of course, why we're looking at this once more is because we want to generate the awareness of what the causes of our suffering are, which is covered in the middle scope, the scope of the intermediate being, in the Lam Rim. That person of middling capacity who wants to be free of samsara and needs to know the causes by which we are all circling in samsara. So it's in that context that we are presenting minds and mental factors. So it's not an investigation of all the various tenet systems, particularly of mind only and so on. It's meant to be, how do we get to know our minds and the various aspects of our minds, features of our minds, so that we can attain liberation and enlightenment. So he goes on to say, nevertheless, the manner in which the mind basis of all exists or does not exist and so forth is an especially crucial difficult point, unshared by the upper and lower tenet systems. Furthermore, Asanga and his brother Vasubandhu are followers of the Sutra Unraveling the Thought. When differentiating between the interpretable and definitive scriptures, they posit the mind basis of all and explain all phenomena as being the nature of mind only. So he's saying this is a particularly difficult point that, it's worth investigating to some degree, because these folks that are following the mind-only teachings are relying upon a sutra of the Buddha. The Buddha did teach the sutra that's called Sutra Unraveling the Thought, and in that is introduced many of the fundamental tenets of mind only. And essentially what they hold, I was mentioning earlier with regard to the mind basis of all, the storehouse consciousness, it holds all of these kinds of karmic imprints and seeds, what are called bakchak. It is the storehouse for all of those, and it is on the basis of those that an experience arises, according to mind only. When those things fire or come into, their ripening, we have a experience of a subjective awareness and an objective field that we are knowing. So let's go back to my eye consciousness that was seeing the purple on Jane's shirt. We'll just stick with one example tonight. So when my eye consciousness was knowing the purple on Jane's shirt, what the mind-only school essentially is saying is that I had a seed, a karmic seed or imprint there for the arising of a consciousness seeing purple and the purple that it's seeing. And this is an illusion, according to mind only, because there's a perspective in my mind through my ignorance, through my afflicted mentality, that purple exists out there on its own as an external object, that it's an external object to my mind. But mind only says that's not true, because what's happening is that imprint is firing and giving the impression that purple is being seen, and my consciousness is arising in the aspect of purple. And so there is this kind of dual things coming out of this one seed, an objective field and a subjective awareness. There is no external reality to that objective field. And their way of perceiving emptiness is to recognize the lack of that external reality, which is kind of useful in some ways. They say that the Buddha taught this because we obviously have a lot of attachment to the external world. It induces a lot of delusion. So if we have the idea that it's kind of like a dream, that objects are appearing from a mental seed, that all that's happening is a firing of that, a ripening of that, that gives the appearance of purple, gives the appearance of an eye consciousness knowing purple, but none of that is based on an external reality, that it's all happening within the mind. This is why we use the term mind only, that it's all arising within a mental sphere, kind of like our dreams, right? In our dreams, when we're dreaming about something, that physical object isn't there in our room, hopefully, if it's something really frightening or what have you, but what is going on in the dream state is said to mirror in the mind only thinking what is happening in reality, but we're blind to that reality. So the way that mind only says that we have to know emptiness is by knowing the lack of that external world, that external world isn't really established as external, but rather arising through the firing of these bakchaks, these imprints. That's in essence what's going on. According to the Prasangika interpretation of that, there can be different ways that can be posited. It's actually a very helpful view, as I said, for a lot of people to hold. What they say is that you can't get as far on the path with that view. But again, this is up for debate. I'm sure people who hold that view would probably be willing to debate that. So anyway, we'll kind of set that aside for the moment. But this is all due to the fact that, again, Asanga and Vasubandhu came to be mind only. Asanga is known for to be the charioteer, or the one who posited the mind only system in a very more practical way, so that people could actually engage in it. But it has its roots in the Buddha's teachings. It has its roots in the Sutra Unraveling the Thought. Now, on the other hand, as we'll see continuing in the text, it says the protector Nagarjuna and his spiritual son, Aryadeva, remember we ran into those folks last week in the homage, are followers of the King of Meditative Stabilization Sutra and the teachings of Akshayamati Sutra. When differentiating between interpretable and definitive sutras, they do not accept the mind basis of all. And explaining the intention of sutras, which teach the mind basis of all as being of interpretable meaning and bearing an underlying intention, they conclude that all phenomena are merely imputed by conceptions. So it's just presenting this idea that, again, when we start talking about these two different Mahayana systems, said to be higher systems because they are working with the selflessness of phenomena as opposed to just selflessness of the person, that what mind only is saying in doing that, although they're relying upon a sutra, according to the higher, what is said to be the higher point of view in this system, which is the middle way schools, that sutra is meant to be interpretable. It's not meant to be definitive. It's meant to be interpreted and not meant to be relied upon to discern the nature of reality at its deepest level. And the sutras that are mentioned here, the King of Meditative Stabilizations and the teachings of Akshayamati, are meant to be definitive in terms of how they present emptiness, which is in accord with what we study here in this school, in this system, the Prasangika Madhyamaka, which is that all phenomena are merely designated by conception, merely imputed by our conceptual mind. It doesn't mean that there isn't an external basis for those phenomena, as mind only posits, because we can still point to things like the purple on Jane's shirt. It's just, how does that purple on Jane's shirt exist? Only by mere imputation. There's nothing from the side of the purple that is appearing to my mind that establishes it as purple. Purple is not established from the side of the object. It's established 100% from the side of the conceptual mind, knowing that purple. So again, this is what they hold for all phenomena, whether we talk about persons, physical phenomena in our world, and so on. All of this can be established to be merely imputed by the mind. So again, this is just a paragraph that delineates that, this does require some investigation, as he says. This is worth exploring, whether mind basis of all exists or not. What is the true nature of reality? What is the way that selflessness of phenomena exists? But he's nonetheless not going to use this text to explore all of that, because he mostly wants to focus on why we're in the state that we're in. And he's going to rely upon, we will see as we go through the text, the point of view of the middle way school, the point of view that is expounded by Nagarjuna and Aryadeva, and make that, again, the main teaching that is being put forward as we look at the deluded states of mind that are keeping us in psychic existence and unenlightened, and those states of mind that we need to generate in order to reverse that situation. So the next paragraph, and sorry that this is kind of cumbersome going through this, but the text will get a little bit easier once we get through this introductory stuff and we actually get into the mental factors. It says here in the next paragraph, in this manner, with regard to the mode of the great vehicle in the land of superiors, that is India, there are what are renowned as the two systems of the great trailblazers. However, it is not the case that they differ in terms of the attitude, the generation of the altruistic mind of enlightenment, bodhicitta, and conduct, the six perfections, the paramitas and so forth. Rather, the distinction between them lies in the view. Although such differences do exist, the views of these two great trailblazers, Nagarjuna and Asanga, are not superior or inferior to each other from their own side. Rather, through the force of the mentality of the trainees, two ways of commenting on the conqueror's intention have arisen, just as the conqueror himself had predicted in many sutras. So he's just saying, yeah, these two systems developed as, ways of working with what the Buddha taught. And we have to say that, again, the Buddha intended for teachings to be applicable to certain people in certain places in their life and certain times and so on. So there's nothing to be, looked down upon in regard to any of these teachings, but rather to acknowledge that there's great masters who propounded these on the basis of the great master, the Buddha himself, having delineated them in these particular sutras. And I know there could be people that from the outside looking in might look at Buddhism and say, well, if you've got a teacher behind your tradition that teaches different things at different times that seem to say different solutions to the problem, well, how is that said to be someone who we'd want to rely upon? But it's actually very skillful. This is what they call skillful means, to be able to teach in accord with where particular beings are at. And so there are many people who will come to various tenet systems and ideas in Buddhism and see them as exactly what they need. But we nonetheless have to, each of us, investigate the teachings to make sure that what we're holding and what we discern to be truth is the final truth, is something that we can rely upon in all ways. And so this is, again, what we're being encouraged to do as part of our study. So the final paragraph there, it says, thus, if you wish to know precisely the uncommon essential points of this system of Asanga, the mind only, such as the way oppositing the mind basis of all, just as it appears in the texts of Asanga and his brother Vasubandhu, as well as the proof that all phenomena are of the nature of mind only based on that essential point, then you should understand them by looking carefully at the texts of Asanga and his brother Vasubandhu, as well as the excellent explanations of the foremost omniscient Tsongkhapa. Tsongkhapa himself delineated in great detail the mind-only view in the text that's known as Lekshi Ningpo, the essence of eloquence. In the master's program, we actually studied the first part of that on mind-only. And then, of course, Tsongkhapa goes on to discuss the interpretable and the definitive sutras according to the middle way schools, and kind of goes through what they propound. But it's a very difficult text, but really insightful. There's actually the translation of the mind-only version is in a book by Jeffrey Hopkins. I can't remember the name of it right now. Anyway, might be Emptiness in the Mind Only. Pardon? The third Karmapa is more accessible, Jane says. Okay, I haven't read that, but anyway, it says there in the next sentence, if you wish to understand the uncommon essential points of the protector Nagarjuna's thought, then you should know them by carefully referring to the foremost omniscient Tsongkhapa's great commentaries on Nagarjuna's treatise on the Middle Way, and on Chandrakirti's supplement to the Middle Way, the greater and lesser special insight, meaning the special insight sections of the Lamrim Chenmo, the great exposition on the stages of the path, as well as the medium exposition of the stages of the path, the middle length Lamrim, which Geshe Sherab is teaching here in Santa Fe when he's here, and so forth. These are excellent explanations, difficult to find in the three worlds. So he's kind of essentially saying, he doesn't want to gloss over completely the idea of what these various systems teach, but nonetheless, what we're going to be focusing on in this course is primarily to look at what is shared in terms of a presentation of minds and mental factors. Yet you will still see when he gets to defining things that he will rely upon the Prasangika point of view in terms of coming to understand our different views that are unwholesome, as well as those that are able to bring forth enlightenment and liberation. So let me see if there's any questions up to that point, before I kind of go back to talk about relating minds and mental factors, because I thought this section might be better covered before, simply because it's just about primary minds, just about what we call these main consciousnesses. Any questions from here? Or we've got one from here. If anybody online has a question, just chime in just a moment. Yeah, Rick? Uh-huh. um, Rick's question was, he was thinking that if he, in terms of mind only, if he leaves here tonight and he goes through all the red lights, he could get through all the red lights because he thinks the red lights are only in his mind. Well, again, but why is there a red light appearing rather than a green light? I mean, we still, in mind only, it's not that they don't trust any appearances. They just come to understand the way that those appearances are occurring. So it's not to say that you still don't have the appearance of samsara, for example. Let's forget the red lights and green lights. Let's talk about samsara and nirvana. They're two different appearances, right? The appearance of samsara is what we are conditioned to through our contaminated karma, and mind only would say the same thing. It's just how they say that that arises on the basis of these bakchaks that give rise to an appearance of samsara, to the red lights and the people and the everything else that exists in samsara, and all of the delusions that we have in terms of, our relation to that. I'm not trying to equate samsara to the physical world, but nonetheless, it is all arising through the force of our contamination. Samsara is the state of having that occur. So it's not that mind only says there is none of that. That doesn't exist at all. He's saying it doesn't exist external to the mind. And this is a deeper form of insight that is necessary in order to achieve liberation and, enlightenment specifically, not even liberation. But it's not negating that there is an appearance of a red light. It's just negating that that red light is external to the mind. Jane's saying because the red light means something different to you than it does to a dog. And yeah, and that's because of our karmic seeds. So yeah. So I mean, it's the same thing. It's the same thing in Prasangika. If we say everything's merely imputed by the mind, that means that our conceptuality is what's dictating the existence of things. But it doesn't mean that there's no external basis for that object. So we could say, I'm merely imputing the bus that's coming at me. I'm just going to walk right in front of it because it's merely imputed. That doesn't work that way, because you have a basis upon which that imputation is occurring. That basis is quite functional as a bus, even though we're merely imputing it as a bus. Oh. Uh-huh. Okay. So Jane's saying there are some branches of... Mm-hmm. Okay. So anyway, Jane was saying that there are some schools of mind only that do posit some existence of external worlds. But again, the point of what we're talking about is just that there is a relevance to a red light appearing to you that is functional within this world, whether it is arising through the force of a bakchak or whether it is merely imputed by the mind. You still have to respect that functionality. You see what I'm saying? Because this is, again, it's not. And the other thing is, I don't want to in any way diminish the importance of what you're saying, because I think it's an important question to pursue. Because when we look at these ideas of mind only, or even what Prasangika is saying in terms of mere imputation, it's important to understand the ramifications of that. That it's not saying that even when we use the idea that things are like a dream, it doesn't mean that they are a dream. That there's absolutely no relevance to anything that's occurring to us because it's a dream, and there's no consequences of our dreams. We wake up from our dreams and they're all gone. We don't have to deal with it. There is some significance to reality that needs to be respected, this sort of conventional reality. That's reassuring, he says. Okay. All right. Any questions from our folks in Denver or elsewhere? Got to figure out how to get this screen share thing going. I don't know why I can't, unless I have to like end the slideshow or something. Let me go on for a few more slides, at least to introduce this next part. We've got about another 15 minutes. So I went through the 3 conditions. Let's talk about mental factors now, because I want to introduce this topic, and we'll go into more detail as we go into the text. And I want to do it the same way I did main minds. I started off in main minds by giving the definition from the first part of mind and cognition from Perbichuk. Perbichuk says that a mental factor is a knower that apprehends any of the features of its object and accompanies whatever main mind has similarity with it. So it's not the knower that's knowing the mere entity of the object. It's not that level of awareness that we're calling main minds or primary consciousnesses. It is rather apprehending any of the features of the object, or even we could say again, performing particular functions with regard to that cognition. We're going to see that mental factors are varied. The presentation that we're going to look at has 51 mental factors divided into 6 different groups, and we'll see those in a moment. But the idea behind this is that this is a more specific part or feature within our consciousness. It's not the main kind of mere entity of that awareness. And there's some analogies that are going to help us to kind of get an idea for what that means. Let's go on to the next slide, where this is from Geshe Rabtin talking about mental factors. He says, the mental factors each have a specific function in dealing with a particular quality of the objective field. Generally speaking, there are innumerable mental factors. However, in the Compendium of Abhidharma, that should say Asanga, not Asanga, Asanga enumerates 51 in order to clearly present those that are the most important. As I said, this is tailor-made for Buddhist study. This is not meant to be some kind of other investigation of the mind for whatever other purposes. What we're going to look at in terms of these 51 are every one of them being quite relevant to our practice and to understanding our minds in a Buddhist practice context. So these 51 are the most important, but as was indicated in that first sentence, they each have a specific function in dealing with a particular quality of the objective field. All right? Or a quality of the mind that we are bringing to the bear in regard to that objective field. Such as when I'm seeing that purple on Jane's shirt, if I have a feeling of attachment for it, if I go, oh, I really want that color purple in my life, I want that shirt then. I want, to take the shirt off Jane's back. I can't wait till she leaves it here and I'll take it home or whatever. So I can have all this kind of attachment arising on the basis of that. That's one mental factor. Or I could have, looking at the color purple on Jane's shirt, I might have some wisdom that I cultivate in regard to seeing the emptiness of that and understanding that that purple is merely imputed and, not existing from its own side or what have you. So that also is another mental factor that we can cultivate. So now we're going to cover the differences between these 2 categories, which is the first part of the explanation that starts on page 10. When we begin this sort of, it says there, the explanation of minds, but nonetheless, it starts out by delineating the difference between minds and mental factors, which is kind of what we're doing in this presentation of mental factors. So as it says on the top of page 10, regarding the difference between a mind and a mental factor, Maitreya's discrimination of the middle and the extreme says that which sees an object is a primary consciousness, that which sees its attribute is a mental factor. Now, see here is meant to be knows, it's not meant to be visually seeing. But the idea is, again, that the mental or the mind, the primary mind, is that which has this just general awareness of an object, whereas that which is getting at various attributes or having a specific relationship to it is what we call the mental factors. Vasubandhu's Treasury of Knowledge, this is, again, one of the main texts that we're using as a source, or that Yeshe Gyaltsen used as a source for this, says, primary consciousnesses know individually. Of course, we saw that quote a little bit later, so I don't need to explain individually. Again, it had those kind of 2 aspects of being separate, kind of knowing its own objects, but also not having 2 of it arise at the same time. There's only an individual eye consciousness, an individual ear, an individual nose, and so on. Kind of having that individual entity, and that's the way that these primary consciousnesses know. Just as it has been said above, Yeshe Gelsen continues, that which knows the mere entity of an object is called a mind. That which, taking the observation of that very object as its basis, engages the object by means of the isolates of other attributes, such as its function, is called a mental factor. So I have to introduce this word isolates. Isolate is a word you come across when you do study the subject that's called Dura, which is collected topics. And isolate is really referring to a way that our conceptual mind gets at things. We kind of, according to the Satrantika presentation, again, this lower school presentation, our conceptual mind gets at what something is by eliminating everything that it isn't. We kind of say, the purple that I see on Jane's shirt is actually non-purple. It's the opposite of non-purple. It's the opposite of everything that isn't purple. Which it sounds like very strange. Like, does my mind actually go through all of those, hijinks in order to, know what the color purple is? But it's also used frequently, this term isolate, as talking about the things that we can mentally isolate in regard to any particular thing that is occurring. The things that we can conceptually get at. Even when we talk about in this school this idea of the emptiness of something versus the phenomenon that exists that is empty, those are two different isolates. They are two things that we can conceptually talk about, but they are actually quite bound up in the same ball, the same thing. So isolate is used here to refer to, in this context, the idea that we have this main mind that is knowing things, but nonetheless we can isolate out particular factors through our conceptual thinking about them to know what is all transpiring at that moment of mind. As you'll see, many of them are present with each other. It's not that these 51, only one of them happens at any one time. You have 5, for example, that are always there, and you have another 5 that are there when the mind is ascertaining a particular object. And then you have many others that can inform it, depending upon whether it's virtuous or whether it's afflicted or whether it's, anyway, you'll see as you go through the study that essentially there are many different mental factors that can be arising in the same moment of consciousness. But we need to kind of isolate out what they are, to kind of see that at any particular moment in consciousness, we have several different aspects of the mind that are helping us to have the cognition of what's going on, helping us to have that experience. That experience may be good, may be bad, may be indifferent, but nonetheless, there's many facets to it, many features. So this term that's being used here by means of the isolates of other attributes, there is a footnote on there. It says the Tibetan word dokpa, translated here as isolate, literally means reverse and indicates a double reverse or double negation. For more information on this topic, you can go to Purdue's Debate in Tibetan Buddhism, which is or you can just, as Jane is shaking her head, no, you can just skip that. I actually did a little course on debate in Tibetan Buddhism here, and we didn't use as much of his book, but we certainly use it as sort of a basis, but enough of it, maybe too much of it. But nonetheless, this idea is that we do have a faculty in our conceptual mind to be able to isolate out various factors. How that's occurring, again, this idea of a double reverse, that we actually know what something is by knowing the opposite of what it's not. That's kind of a strange way to talk about things. I'll share an example that I thought was kind of useful to get my head around it. When we were learning this over in Italy, the teaching assistant, Jampa Gendon, he said, when you're an infant and you're learning what things are, then you tend to lump things together until you have an idea of how things are categorically different than other things. So for example, you see something come into the room that's got fur all over it and 4 legs and a head and tail, and you don't know what it is, and your parents say, oh, doggy, doggy. And then the next furry thing with 4 legs and a head and a tail that you see, you go doggy, and they go, no, kitty. And so you tend to always be defining things by them being the outside of what they're not, that you do find some room for things in a negative process. Anyway, I thought it was helpful. Maybe it wasn't so helpful, but this is how we actually, if we go back, it's hard to remember when we first learned what things were, but we went through a conceptual process of coming to understand many things by virtue of what they weren't, by negating that they weren't. No, that isn't that what that is, it's this. And so I don't know. Anyway, so let's go on then with the text. It says there, it is just as it has been said by the omniscient Gyaltsa in his Essence of the Ocean of Knowledge, an explanation of the Compendium of Knowledge. And this is a quote from that, this indented paragraph. It says, "A main mind, such as a sense consciousness apprehending form, is explained to know individually its object. Just so, such a main mind does not depend on an ascertaining consciousness being produced. Rather, it is distinguished by merely observing form. One should know the mental factors in its retinue, meaning that those mental factors that arise together with it, by way of each of their various functions, such as having taken that observation of form as the basis, moving the mind towards it. This is actually the function of a factor we're going to see shortly in a few classes. It's called intention. It's one of our omnipresent mental factors. It causes us to move to particular objects. That's its function. Or we can also see each of their various attributes, such as non-forgetfulness of an object that has been previously realized. This is also, as is said to be one of our virtuous mental factors, is non-forgetfulness, is our mindfulness that allows us to retain, qualities that we are trying to be aware of and so on. So he's just kind of saying that, this is what we're going to be delineating, is this idea that within a main mind there are going to be things we can identify as mental factors by way of their various functions, by way of their various attributes. Therefore, he says, a main mind is a knower distinguished by mere observation of the object itself and does not need to be posited in terms of the other attributes, whereas a mental factor is a knower that, taking the observation of that very object as its basis, engages the object by means of the isolates of other attributes, such as the outcome of its function. So again, this is a lot of language, a lot of words around it, but the idea is that we're going to have two different ways of talking about parsing up what we call our conscious experience. The main minds, that whole body of these 6 primary consciousnesses, is knowing the mere entity, and we're not going to talk about it in terms of any other attributes. All the individual attributes, functions, and so on are all encapsulated in what we mean by the mental factors. So when I talk about my eye consciousness observing the purple in Jane's shirt, that's a mere knowing the mere entity of that purple. It's not defining any other discrimination of that purple as being different from another purple I've seen, or the feeling that might arise on the basis of seeing that purple, or the intention that moves the mind to that purple, or any of the other factors that we're going to be examining. Or again, the attachment that might arise in regard to that purple, or whatever the case might be. So there's a whole kind of delineation of these two, the differences between these two. Let's pause here. It's 8:14, and I'm just going to share maybe 1 or 2 slides, and then we'll conclude for tonight. In terms of the slide that you have in front of you now, this is from Geshe Rabten again. A primary mind, main mind, is defined as a primary cognition established by means of its apprehension of the fundamental presence of the object. It is not the function of a primary mind to be specifically concerned with any aspect of the objective field. It is mere consciousness of the data presented to it. As we shall see, it is the individual mental factors that are responsible for the selection and processing of this data. Go on to a couple more just here to insert these before we conclude. This is from Venerable George in his oral commentary. He says, the mental factors engage the particularities of the perceptual field, whereas the main mind is defined as just knowing the perceptual field. And I'm giving you different presentations to give different language around it. It can sometimes be helpful to kind of get an idea of what's meant by that. So those are kind of to give us an idea of the difference. That kind of concludes that topic. We've got one more topic as an introductory topic that is the relationship between these minds and mental factors. That's going to be the next slide, is kind of saying what pages we're going to cover in regard to that, from the bottom of page 10, where this qualm is raised about what is the relationship with them. Are they one entity? Are they different entities? And then we'll even look at what are called the 5 similarities. They're presented in 2 different ways, but kind of 5 ways that we can say that the mental factors and the main mind in which they're arising have something that is the same, something that is in common. And that will give us the basis, again, for just understanding the relationship between these two, the body of mental factors as well as the main minds that they arise in. And then from there, we'll begin our exploration of the mental factors. I promise. So let's see if there's any final questions from folks back there. Let me end the slideshow and see what happens if I can get back online with this. Okay. Can everybody see me again now? Okay. So does anybody have any questions or concerns? Criticisms even? Okay.
None from Denver.
None from Denver. Okay. So again, we do have one question from Rachel here. Okay. Mm-hmm. Right. Exactly. Yeah. Rachel was asking about the definition that I gave from Perpachuk that was saying, it's similar with the main mind for the mental factors. That similarity is what we're going to be looking at in terms of the relationship. Again, we are mentally isolating these various aspects of mind, and we're going to say these are the mental factors, this is the main mind, and parse them up in that way, divide them into two. But they're really arising within the same moment of mind. And so it's only our mental picking them apart in a sense that allows us to do that. But we can see then that there must be similarities, things that they have in common because they're not distinct. It's not like my mental factors are arising over here, my main mind over here, and there's nothing, relating between either of them. But it's an important thing to just understand that it's a way of getting at, through our conceptual awareness, all the various pieces of this moment of cognition, all the things that are occurring. Because some of them are going to be repetitive because they're in every moment, like the first 5 that are the omnipresent. We have those in every moment of cognition, whether it's my eye consciousness seeing that purple or whether it's my mental consciousness thinking about emptiness. They're always going to be there. And then you're going to have some that are there only when the object is being ascertained. Then you're going to have some that are there when it's virtuous, some that are there when the mind's afflicted, some that are changeable, all these various categories. We'll get into those as we go through. Any other comments, questions? Okay. Yes, Jane. After, yeah, let's do it after. We'll have an announcement here afterwards. But so those folks who are online, if you have the prayers, we're going to do the usual 2 dedication prayers, the Gewadi and the Jongchob Semchok. We'll do these in English though. And here in Santa Fe on page 235, we'll recite those first 2 prayers on that page, again in English. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. Then we'll do the long life prayers on page 244. We'll do the 2 prayers for His Holiness's long life, as well as Lama Zopa, our spiritual director. And as we recite these 2 prayers, think that we're creating the causes for all spiritual guides that we and others have karmic connections with to continue to abide in this world with good health, and for us and others to never be parted from perfect guides in all of our lifetimes. In the land encircled by snow mountains, you are the source of all happiness and good. All-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. You who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers honoring the 3 jewels, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. And then finally, dedicate for anyone who you're holding in your heart right now, whether it's beings who are experiencing obstacles, illness, who are dying or who have died. Kind of share this positive energy with them so they might be free from their suffering and find true peace and happiness. And we can think in particular about John and others in our community who are suffering at this time, and the folks in Denver as well, any of their community. And then may all sentient beings attain true peace and happiness through our efforts here tonight. Okay, thank you all. Thank you all who have shared through live streaming. And send me any comments if there's things, and I might want to talk to you, Justin, about how we toggle between the sharing and the not, because I'm not sure that I got that tonight. I know I didn't get it tonight, so okay.
Thank you, Don. Fantastic.
right.
Thank you so much.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Okay.
Good
Bye-bye.
night.
Good night.
night.
Thanks, Don.
Good night.
Thanks,
Thank you, Don.
Good night. Okay.